Kind of. I don't like the bio we had on the website. I grabbed the other bio from the conference a couple weeks ago.
Oh, I wasn't even paying attention to any of that stuff.
Oh, you're good.
The less said about me, the better, I guess.
I know, I know. I get it. True story. I think we got all 18 of us, Jerry. I think we're
All right,
ready.
anytime you're ready.
Oh, I was looking to see what George put in there. Handbook of Survey Note Keeping. Oh, we'll have to find that one.
Who's that one by?
William.
F. William Pafford.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Because there was another little soft cover one that I remember from years ago, and I don't know if I've still got that one or not. It's a little pocket handbook type of thing.
Well, this one's really good. It shows you how to set up notes for all different kinds of things: control
Yeah.
traverses, little boundary surveys, all kinds of differential levels, free wire levels, uh, and it gives you some good ideas on what to include in a sketch if you're going to do a sketch,
Right,
which
yeah.
really helpful, I think.
We're gonna have to. I'm gonna. I'm not gonna lose any of that in the recording, so we're gonna have to start with part of that conversation, and then I'll. There's a couple more. We got the couple. We got the 20 while we were waiting there, Jerry.
Okay.
Jerry began teaching in 1979, and although he has retired multiple times, we'll say he has taught at the University of Wisconsin Platteville, Purdue University, Penn State, Wilkes-Barre,
Looks there,
Madison,
yeah.
yeah, Madison area technical college. Retired for a year, then returned back to Platteville to teach part time for 7 more years before retiring again. And then he just can't get enough of the entire profession. So then he's decided to work with CST in a NLC prep, mentoring Mondays, wisdom Wednesdays. Some days he'll retire, but hopefully never anytime soon. So for those that were at our Western conference with California, Nevada, Jerry gave this presentation actually last year in Las
Yeah.
Vegas, and then
Yeah.
again in Reno this year. So I asked Jerry if he would kind of give an abbreviated version of it, at least for tonight, and so we can kind of get it. But Jerry's been fortunate enough to run around to a few different conferences and has been presenting this field note topic. So as always, I love when you're on, Jerry, and I love you taking the time to help us out again.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah,
This is one of those, why are we still talking about this kind of
I
stuff
know
topic, you know?
exactly.
And I come at it from a couple of different perspectives, coming back from education as well as on a professional, from a professional viewpoint and that type of thing. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I do have a website that I maintain of open access surveying instruction, open access library, jerrymahun.com. You're welcome to check out any of that material there, and any of the stuff I do for mentoring Mondays I put up there also. And lately, a couple of different seminars I've been doing at different states. I've been putting up some material up there also. And I'm always available to answer any questions that you have on stuff. One of the luxuries of being semi-retired, quasi-retired, whatever it is. I have an opinion on everything. Um, and I judiciously don't charge for it, so I can't help be liable for anything that you do based on what I tell you. So, all right. So we get into this measurement documentation. I like to call it, I suppose, a field note. Sounds a little fancier than that type of thing. It's just like, I don't call them plumb bobs either. I call them non-corroding gravity vector indicators. That way I can charge more money for when I do my consulting work. But basically, what are field notes? And when we look back and we look at historically at some of the examples of previous field notes that we still use today, that are still important to us today. It's a written record of the field measurements people normally think of as it's what we do on the field, but it's more than just the measurements. It also includes the conditions, the equipment, and the personnel that were that contributed to those measurements. This last gig that I had here teaching at UW Platteville was in the civil engineering department. And the civil engineering program here at Platteville still keeps the commitment of having at least one surveying class for all their engineers to take. So I would have anywhere between 70 and 90 students a semester taking a surveying class. It'd be the only one they took, but it gave them an idea. It didn't make them surveyors, but it gave them an idea where surveying information comes from, and judgments that they could make about the quality of the information. So they understood some of the things that surveyors had to go through in order to collect information. And then once they create a project and send it out, what has to go into putting that out in the field. So one of the things we talk a lot about is errors. And the conditions, the equipment, and the personnel, those are your error sources. That's where all the errors come from. And that works hand in hand with the field measurements to make a connection between the two, so that you can make a judgment on those numbers besides just looking at the numbers themselves. There's also ancillary information that's going to vary based on the project. There'll be different kinds of sketches, some corrective notes, some descriptions, other types of things that we may include that we feel are important and that we want to document for that measurement operation, because somebody else may be using this information later on, and they need to be able to understand what was done out in the field, what was captured out in the field, and how they can use that information. Well, the question always comes up, and I get this all the time when I was teaching. We use data collectors. I mean, we're not that Luddites that we don't use data collectors in the classroom in that type of situation, but we work our way up to them. But students always say when they finally get to the data collector part, why do we take field notes? Why don't we just go straight to digital data collection? You know, and there's all sorts of reasons and excuses why do field notes. They're slow to compile. Nobody likes to slow down and write this stuff. They're cumbersome in the field. The surveying process slows to a snail's pace. They're less efficient data collection. We can't capture the massive data that we can with digital data collection. And one of my favorites is penmanship is a lost art. Nobody teaches penmanship anymore. So to try to read people's chicken scratching is almost impossible these days. They take up a lot of storage space, on and on and on. There's all sorts of reasons and excuses for not using field notes. And I'm not an advocate of saying that we get rid of digital data collection entirely and replace them with field notes. I think field notes still have a role in an augmenting role with digital data collection. But from like putting on my teacher's hat, for a new technician or somebody that's learning the process, it reinforces the procedure that we're trying to teach and how to collect data, and ensure that the right data is collected and that the checks are built into the system. And it helps them visualize the measurements. When they have to write numbers down physically, right after making the measurements, they're looking at what they're measuring, and they make that connection between the two. And it's a more effective data capture for some information types. A lot of the times we have to use sketches or descriptions of things, jot down some notes in that. And that's not as easy to collect necessarily in a digital data collection environment. I know we got cameras and videos and all this kind of stuff we can do now, but there's still some things that are better to capture in a written form, particularly evidence recordation, a signed parole statement. A parole statement that's signed in writing carries a lot more weight in a courtroom situation than does a digital file, simply because of the medium that it's presented under. So that's another reason to have at least a field book in the back pocket that can be pulled out to support or to augment some field operations. Flexibility. One of my big beefs with data, with computers and software is, somebody has to write the software, somebody has to design the system, and that person has to know something about how data is collected and all the different variations there are in order to come up with a software platform that's flexible enough to meet all of our needs that we have out in the field. They just can't do it. It's impossible. And we're going to run into special types of situations that the digital data collection just doesn't handle. Field notes can handle any kind of situation you come up with. We can make them as flexible as need be to meet a particular situation. And they create a permanent operation, a permanent record of the field operations. They can last forever with simple care. Trent, out in your part of the country, what time did the PLS come through your states, through your state there?
What time?
Yeah, what time frame? 18 what?
Oh, our first license. Well, I know California was like 1899 or something like that, but
1899.
I think around the
Yeah,
30s. I think
our surveys, our survey started back in the 1830s in Wisconsin here. We weren't the first ones to do it, but you know what? Those records, those physical records, still exist. Now they're getting more fragile and that type of stuff, so we've had to scan them and make them available in different formats. But those original records are still there. They'll last forever if you take care of them and that type of thing. I've seen digital data go belly up, depending on the kind of magnetic fields it's exposed to. There's all sorts of things that can affect it.
On that note, Jerry, Steve Parrish has a bunch of old GLO surveyor books that he's actually working on getting scanned. He's got a couple hundred books, but we've been looking to photograph them through. We're actually trying to work with UNR to maybe get it through their photography department to take pictures of everything and record them that way. But yeah, he's got a lot.
Yeah, kind of along those same lines. We're off on a tangent. We created a surveyor's reference CD here in Wisconsin about 15 years ago, and we collected documents from all over the place: the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service. A lot of these old handbooks are disappearing, and you no longer can see in that. So we're trying to archive them and make them available to users and that type of thing. When I worked for the BLM back in the mid 80s, they used to have, some of you might be familiar with the old slide tape classes that they had. You had the slides and the carousel and the cassette tapes that you would play in the little workbooks and all that kind of stuff. They were in the process of throwing all that stuff out. So we got a hold of some of that stuff and we scanned some of that. We scanned some of the old material. We scanned some of the old slides and that type of stuff, primarily to preserve the way the information was presented and that type of thing. So basically anything that's in written form, the excuse is it takes up too much space, but it lasts forever if you take care of it, or if you back it up in some digital form, it can last forever also. But the point is that it can be a permanent record of the field operations, and you'll keep on coming back to it all the time, as will other people that use your data. On the other hand, remember that they're the original measurements and conditions. This is, when we talk about following in the footsteps of the surveyors, if you look through any legal text dealing with boundary law and stuff, they say if you can recover the original notes, the original data that was collected by the surveyor out in the field, that's the best indication of what actually happened. Because my contention always has been, when I taught legal courses and we do boundary reestablishment, there's three places a boundary can be. One is where it was supposed to have been placed. Two is where the surveyor said he placed it. And three is where he actually did place it. And the importance is in reverse order. Where he actually did place it was where it belongs. If you can't find that, then the next best place is where he said he placed it. Well, where did he say he placed it? His field notes tell you where he placed it. That's a recordation of what happened out in the field. So when we talk about following in the footsteps, that's the original record. And my favorite aspect of field notes is there's no software compatibility issues. Okay? I can take a data collector and I will run into problems transferring the data from one system to another system. Field notes, I never have that problem. When we first started doing large-scale digital data collection, and I started using Civil 3D for the first time, first couple of times I ran a couple hundred points through Civil 3Ds when I discovered Civil 3D doesn't like alphanumeric point IDs. It only likes numeric point IDs. It does strange things to your data without telling you if you try to feed it alphanumeric point IDs. It flips things over all over the place. And I didn't know that. And there was nothing to indicate there was anything wrong with it until I tried to look at my data when I plotted in Civil 3D, and that didn't look anything like what we'd been surveying, that type of thing. So there's always that software compatibility issue that you have to deal with software. And then And then every couple of years, like Civil 3D AutoCAD will change the data format just a little bit so that you can't be backward compatible and all this kind of stuff. There's all sorts of things, little issues you have to deal with software. What are the requirements for good field notes, for taking field notes? Well, field notes should be standalone. And by that, what I mean, minimum explanation should be necessary as to what information they represent and how to interpret it. We don't have the original surveyors from 1833 in Wisconsin anymore to ask them what they were doing, what they meant by what they put in their notes. We just have to deal with what they had in their notes. We have to try to understand that. So the field note should be standalone like that. So someone who has a reason to be using that information has got a reasonable chance of being able to understand it. So we should be able to tell how the data was collected, by whom, and under what conditions. We have a fancy name for that in GIS. That's called metadata. Surveyors have always collected metadata. We've just never called it that. We just call them field notes. So we've always had that support information there for our data. Field notes must be complete, and all the measurement support data included, the good, bad, and the ugly. We're not trying to hide anything. They have to be accurate. And by that, what we mean is not necessarily accurate down to 1,000th of a foot, but they have to be a true record of what was compiled out in the field without any filtering. We don't sit there and mentally go through our numbers before we write them down. We collect the data, we write the data as we collect it. It has to be understandable for a knowledgeable user, and it has to be unaltered. That is, it can't be obscured or unjustifiably modified. Now, we make mistakes when we write things down. There are ways to correct those mistakes so it doesn't appear that we're trying to alter the data. We don't want it to appear that we're altering the data that we're collecting out in the field. Physical format, there are different types of field books. Each has an advantage and disadvantage. There's the traditional hardbound book that's with the gummed and sewn binder. That's probably one of the more difficult ones to work with out in the field because you can't really fold it over on itself. Spiral is a really handy one to have because you can fold it over on itself. And then there's a 6-ring binder where you can actually remove and place pages into it. Each has advantage and disadvantage. No one is necessarily better than the other given the circumstances. When we talk about a page in the field book, we're a little bit different than the way other people talk about pages in field books. In surveying, a page in the field book is when you lay the thing out flat, you've got the left side and the right side. Both together constitute a page. In a regular book, those would be 2 separate pages, 1, 2, 3, 4. But in surveying, you lay them out flat, that's a page. One page, the left plate, is generally where we do our measurements and we do our running calculations. The right plate is where we normally record all of our support information. And any of the sketches, explanatory notes, that type of thing. We may use it if we need additional recording space for measurements or calculations, but generally they work together, measurements and metadata, if you want to think about those ways. At the bottom of the screen here, I've got 2 different sets of field notes we typically use in the surveying class. Left-hand, bottom on the left are differential leveling notes. On the left-hand side are the actual measurements that are taken and the running calculations. On the right-hand side is the explanatory stuff, who the crew was, what the date was, what the weather conditions were, equipment that was used, sketch, benchmark descriptions, any of that kind of stuff. The right-hand side is a variation of a traversing type of set of notes where you're recording both angle measurements and distance measurements so that you're measuring interior angles and distances on both sides of the angle. And again, the right-hand side is the support information with the sketch that shows the actual direction of the angle that we're turning. In addition to the support information, the left-hand page is the measurement information, the angle measurement, and the checks and the calculations on those. We said on the left-hand side, measurements and running comps, and any math checks that we have on there, we typically have a title across the top of the leveling, across the top of the notes to indicate what the particular operation is. And the page number corresponds to laid out flat. And again, we've got the environment, the major equipment, the crew description, sketch, any connection to other information that's important with respect to that. Notes, I'll get back to this later on, are always signed and dated. At the completion of the notes, the person that's the note keeper or responsible for that signs and dates those notes at the end to ensure that they've met all the criteria for collecting that information. Page formats, there's all sorts of different functional page formats depending on the type of field operations. Some are referred to as transit, some are referred to as leveling. There's a wide variety of them. Typically, when you get a bound book, they'll all be the same type of format in there. If you've got a spiral bound one, that's typically the same format throughout. If you've got a 3-ring binder, you can mix and match formats depending on a particular type of job operation that you're doing. A real popular one is the 6-column one here for doing like differential leveling as well as cross-sectioning and horizontal angle measurement. The front and back leaf can be different. Plate can be different depending on the style. And again, we could have mixed formats we have mixed formats in a binder. Let me back up. We have mixed formats in a 6-ring binder compared to a bound book or a spiral bound book. Okay, these are the do's and don'ts of doing field books. And I'm going to kind of compare some of the stuff that we do in classes and set up job field books and compare them to some of the old public land survey notes that we've dug up. So generally we start off with a title page for a project or a job. And if you think back to if you look at a set of field notes from when a township was subdivided into a section, you generally had a field book that was dedicated to that operation. And they had a title page to explain what was being done. So this is a subdivision of Township 35 north of range number 4 west of the Forest Principal Meridian, Wisconsin. And it says when it started, when it ended, who's the deputy surveyor. And then that would be followed by a table of contents at the very end of the book or at the end of the notes would be certification by the surveyor that it's a true and honest record of all the work that was done on the field. So it makes for a complete collection for that field book for that particular project. On the right-hand side is typically the way we would set up field book pages, our field book in our classes, or for a project. We would identify something about the project, the company, the responsible party, and any contact information that may be necessary for that. Table of contents. As needed for the different types of projects. Usually in the course of working a project, you're doing a variety of different types of field operations. You're not going to have one book that's going to be all differential leveling, another book that's going to be all cross-sectioning and that type of thing. You're going to be doing different operations as you're going through different phases of the project. So as you complete those, you enter them into the table of contents at the beginning of the book to kind of help keep the book organized. So again, it can very quickly pull out the information that you need from that particular field book. Consistent page format. The last thing you need is for everybody to get real creative on how they're collecting data so that whoever's going to be going through that's going to try to figure out for the same type of information why it's recorded differently and why some of it makes sense this way and some of it makes sense this way. So you want to be consistent in the format. Most all surveying textbooks have in the appendix and back some standardized type of note forms to take for specific types of operations. George made reference to a little, see if my chat window's open. I can't remember offhand what the name of that was. Handbook of Survey Note Keeping that George made reference to. That had a lot of different types of, different types of, my chat window's in a way. Different types of formats for different field operations. Some of them are probably totally obsolete. I'm sure there's going to be stuff in there on Stadia surveying and that type of thing, which really nobody does anymore. But you'll see standardized formats for that. But again, part of the nice thing about field notes is the flexibility with which you can design the format for the type of operation that you're collecting. Some companies have pre-printed formats that they have their people fill out, because that way then you make sure you're collecting the data that you're supposed to be collecting out of the field and reducing it the correct way. I've lived through a whole bunch of paradigm shifts when it comes to surveying technology that I've got whiplash a number of times. I started out way back with transit and steel tape, and I've worked my way all the way up to this GPS crap stuff now that's going around, you know, and you don't have to hold them level anymore, even for that matter. But you go through all these different paradigm shifts. The way an EDM works, electronic distance measurement works, is it resolves the distance by going through phase shifts in the wavelength. It goes every 10 frequency shifts, and then it measures a partial wavelength and adds up those partial wavelengths to come up with the total distance. Well, you know, in the old days, how they used to go through those phase shifts, you had to sit there with an oscilloscope sitting in front of you on the EDM measuring, and you had to yourself flip them through these different frequencies. And then a frequency measurement would come up, and you'd have to write it down out of form. And then you get to the next frequency, write it down on the form. So you did all the actual calculations, all the machine did that measured those partial wavelengths, but you had to do all the adding up. So you had to fill out the form in a specific fashion and then add up all those partial wavelengths to get the total distance. Man, we thought that was great compared to steel taping. Of course, it takes forever now compared to what it's like nowadays to shoot a distance. But it was just that intermediate type of thing where we still were involved in the data collection process and the reduction of the information. Don't remove pages or plates. That's a form of original data alteration. And when you remove a page or a plate from a field book, it does two things. It brings into question the credibility of the information in the rest of that field book because there's an alteration in it. And secondly, you're destroying information that you unintentionally did not intend to destroy. For instance, when we pull out this page, okay, right in here, because we screwed up some stuff on here and we don't want it to be in there. It's not neat, so we tear it out and we throw it away. We're not only throwing away the measurements for this operation here, but on the back side of this plate are the support information for the previous measurements. Now, when I tear that page out, excuse me, when I tear that page out, not only am I removing the support information for the previous operation, but what's left doesn't make any sense. This support information has no connection whatsoever to the measurement information that's over here on this page here. So I've not only destroyed the integrity of that field book, I've destroyed the integrity of two different surveying operations in it. I can't recover information reliably from either one of those. So you always want to leave that stuff in. If you make a mistake, there's a way to deal with it without having to destroy the field book. One of the problems with taking field notes is it's a small rating surface, and generally it's lousy conditions, and sometimes it's cold outside. In Wisconsin, it's always a challenge to be out there in the winter time doing field work with notes and that type of stuff, because your fingers freeze and it becomes real difficult to write very carefully and clearly in that. But one of the things that you want to be sure of is that you use a pencil with a hard, sharp lead. We used to carry around pencils and sandpaper and stuff to keep our leads nice and sharp, and then a little Boston SP sharpeners came along for our mechanical pencils. But what we generally find out is about a 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencil works relatively well, and a 4H lead, a little bit harder than what you're used to. The paper that's used in field books or for field notes is a tighter bond than regular writing paper. And it's like that to make it a little bit more water resistant. It's not waterproof, it's nowhere near waterproof, but it's a tighter bond, which means that when you write on it with a regular pencil lead, like a 2H that most people use, it doesn't really get into the fibers of the paper. It sits on top more, so it has a tendency to smear. And after a while, your field notes get to be really messy. And one way that I test to see if the lead is hard enough is I'll go to the last page in the field book and I'll print my name, or I'll print some numbers on there. And then with a dry thumb, just run it very hard across that writing. And if it smears at all, then that pencil lead is too soft. It's got to be harder than that. 4/8 is about the practical limit you can go to. You can go harder than that, but if you go harder than that, it's hard to see your writing on there. Plus, you have to really press, and then you start to get impressions into the paper, and it starts to curl up on you, do all sorts of nasty things like that. So 4/8 lead is probably about a pretty good lead thickness or hardness of lead to use for that. People say, well, why don't you use pen? Well, because of that bond of that paper, the ink doesn't soak in as easily as it does on regular paper, so it sits on top, and that smears very easily again also. So 4H pencil is, 4H lead is a pretty good thick hardness of lead to use for recording field notes. Legibility, print, not write. People cannot write to save their lives anymore, and sometimes the printing isn't all that great either. Now, you look back at some of these old PLS notes, and it's obvious they had penmanship instruction in school. And even now, it's easy to read or interpret some of that stuff. As long as you get used to some of the old penmanship shortcuts that they used to use, or some of the language differences. Is everybody familiar with the long S? It looks like an F, but it doesn't have the forward serif. It just has the backward serif. It doesn't have the forward. It's usually used wherever there's double S's. So a lot of around here where the Mississippi River is, if you look at a lot of the notes around, it looks like it's this Mississippi River, because it looks like F's, but those are called long S's. That's an old English style of writing. So once you get the hang of that, then you start to understand some of the other stuff that they've done in there also. But the other thing is, and this is one of the things people complain about, it takes too long to take field notes. There's a reason for that. If you're slow and deliberate in recording the information, you're more likely to be complete and legible when you do record it. So slow and deliberate is important when you're recording information. Page and page styles, talked about that. Record immediately. Students have this tendency to, pre-record on a scratch piece of paper, try to remember numbers before they decide which ones to write down. One of the first measurements I have them do in class, about 2 weeks into the semester, is we do a pacing lab. I lay out a baseline that's a couple 100 feet long, and I have them pace that a bunch of times. And then they'll determine their pace count and use that to measure a couple of other lengths in the area of a parking lot. And for criteria I give them, I tell them I want them to achieve a pacing consistency of 1 in 50. So that means that for every 50 paces, they have a variation of plus or minus 1 pace. And it takes them a while to get down to the point where they get pretty consistent, because they're not used to controlled walking, which is basically what pacing is. And it takes them a while to get the hang of it before they settle down on it. Well, the tendency is to not record any numbers until they start to hit that 1 in 50. And I tell them that's not what we do. We record the numbers as you measure them. And then later on, we decide which of those numbers meet our criteria that we're going to use. It's better to over-record our measurements and then have a larger set to select from than under-record what we're doing out in the field and then wind up pre-selecting before we actually do anything with those numbers. So it's always record them, warts and all, record them. If you get a big bust in there, it's a big bust. I told a story when I did this presentation out in Nevada a couple of weeks back, going through paradigm shifts. When I first started teaching, we used to teach with steel tapes. And if you ever measure with steel tapes, you know it can be a real pain in the butt to measure with a steel tape. even if you're not measuring all that long a distance. Well, I had this one group that was measuring a line that was just about an east-west line. And they measured in one direction, and they got like 460 feet. And they measured in the other direction, they got 360 feet. It's real obvious what happened, right? Because you know, they dropped 100 feet in there. Something. They added 100 feet or dropped 100 feet. Really easy thing to do with tape. So they're all confused. They don't know what to do. Do you average it? Do you measure it again? If you measure it again, that's just that much more time you have to spend. So they asked me what they should do. And I said, well, you got to look at the orientation of the line. It's an east-west line. And when you measure to the west, you're going towards earlier time zones. You're actually measuring faster than when you're measuring to the east. So when you're measuring towards the west, distances are shorter than when you measure towards the east. And they believed me, and they started writing all this crap down. Record the stuff immediately. If you need to remeasure. Toss out the stuff after you've made the measurements now. So record all, warts and all. Don't pre-select what's going to be saved. Let's see. Reasonable, consistent accuracy. This is the other thing that people don't like to do is record things that are equal to 0. If an angle is of 135 degrees, 0 minutes and 0 seconds, that's the way it's recorded. It's not recorded as 135. Just because the minutes and seconds is 0 doesn't mean that they're not there. They're not important. They are important to the accuracy level of that number. The other thing that I try to get them in the habit of doing is writing a 0 in front of a decimal point for a number less than 1, 0.51 instead of 0.51. Because when you got a 4H lead on that field book paper and you try to put that decimal point down there, sometimes it gets lost and you don't see it and you read 51 instead of 0.51. But if you put a 0 in front of the decimal point, it brings the reader on notice that there's something going on here. Why would you put a 0 in front of the 51? And that brings the attention to that decimal point that's there. So there's a couple of things like that you do to try to make sure that it's clear as to what you're recording. The layout reflects the measurement order, top, down, left, and right. Systematic measurement recording. When we're doing differential leveling, there's a pattern. And when you first look at these as a new surveying student, you get confused because you see all these numbers, but you don't see that pattern. But once you recognize the pattern of measuring and calculation, it makes sense as to how this is all collected. And it flows left to right, top to bottom. If you look at a good analogy of that is looking back at the original PLSS field notes. North between sections 20 and 21 on Town 3 North, Range 1 West. Okay, going distance, what did they encounter at what distance? What did they hit? 40 chain, set, quarter post, call in their bearing trees. And then they give a running count of what the terrain was like. And then east on random line between section 16 and 21, distances, what they encountered. So I can still see 100, almost 200 years later, what they encountered, what they set out in the field, what evidence they recorded out there. It's really clear because it's a systematic approach and it's used throughout the entire field book. That's why if you look at the manual of instructions, there's always a set of example field notes in there and an explanation of how to record that information. There's an information in there on how the monumentation is going to be marked to indicate what corner it represents. There's that systematic approach in there so someone can pick that information up later on and understand it without trying to sort through what was going on. Any running calculations should be done as you're doing the operations. You don't wait until later and then do them later on. For instance, when you're running a differential leveling circuit and you're collecting your backsight and foresight distance, foresight readings, you're computing your elevations as you go. So when you get to the end, you close in on your benchmark, you know immediately if you've busted or not. You don't wait until later on. And you do a page check in order to verify that. The students will collect the information and then want to do it later on inside. They don't want to do it out in the field. But one of the things I have them do to reinforce this running calculations business is when they turn the equipment, they turn in their field books at the same time. So they can't do it later on. They have to do it while they're out in the field. You want to be able to identify right away, because my guys, when they go out in the field and they screw something up, it's a matter of walking a couple 100 feet to go out there and remeasure something. If, however, they're on a job site and that job site is 75 miles away and they forget to do something and they make a mistake, you got to pack up the equipment and drive 75 miles back out to the job site to re-record something or remeasure something. That's not real efficient use of time. So you want to be sure that you're verifying all the information as soon as you're collecting it. Some stuff has got built-in checks. If anybody's ever done three-wire leveling, you know, there's a lot of calculations involved with three-wire leveling. But the upside to that is three-wire leveling is very self-checking, and you don't make mistakes, reading mistakes on a backside or foresight reading like you can in differential leveling, because you're making 3 readings each time, and the math of those 3 readings support that center crosshair reading, plus it gives you the distances and that type of thing. So even though there's a lot of calculations, all those calculations are quality assurances that you're getting the right readings and that you're balancing the backside and the foresight distances within whatever the criteria is for the type of leveling or the order and class of leveling that you're doing. So there's a reason we do it all that way. Page check for verification. Some of our comps, we do have page checks and that type of thing. My students, when they close off on the benchmark, it's say, well, we closed within 300ths of a foot. How is that? And I say, I don't know. I won't know until you do a page check to verify that the math is correct and that type of thing. And whether they met the criteria for that particular operation. If there's a criteria they have to meet, they have to close within. In this particular case, 200ths of a foot times a square root, a number of elevations they established. Did they meet that criteria? And if they did, done. The thing that they, and again, this is the visualization of the field notes. When they bust, and always the good one is when they bust a couple of feet, 10 feet, they come in on an elevation, they close off 10 feet. They're standing right there in the field where they just made all these measurements. You'd think that if they blew it 10 feet, they could stop and look around them and see which of these elevations doesn't make sense by 10 feet with respect to the other ones. Being out in the field and making that connection with what they just wrote down to what they just measured reinforces that measurement operation. The one that I love is when they close off almost exactly 1 foot. They'll close off on an elevation on a benchmark of exactly 1 foot. And I know exactly where that happens from all these years of experiences. I asked them, the very first thing I asked them is, where's your shortest length? Because what's probably happened is what? Anybody guess? When you're exactly 1 foot off on an elevation?
Read one of the bottom wires or top wires, or
well, what they did was they're concentrating so much on the tenths and the hundredths of a foot reading that they mentally grab the red number that's in there that represents the full foot mark, and that could be the one that's below the it should be the one that's above the crosshairs. So they're reading 5.43, but it really should be 4.43. And where that happens is on short sights, where they've got a very limited view of the rod and only one red number appears in it, and that's the one that's too high. So we start to see things like that, you can kind of figure out, well, where's your shortest line? That's just probably rerun that one and see if that's where it occurred. And then 9 times out of 10, they'll find that. So that's again, making that connection between what's written down and what they see out in the field, it reinforces the operations that they're doing.
In your example there, the shot that was 3.97 feet would be a classic place to make that mistake because they're looking at a 4.
Yep.
Yeah. And sometimes you got to remember with new people, they don't always, when it's off almost 4 feet or almost 3 feet, I can guarantee you what's wrong is they didn't extend the right part of the rod. Okay, when you got these collection rods and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And I said, the key is if you look through there and you're reading 12.6 feet and you can see Joe's face right behind the rod at that reading, something's not right, because Joe's not 12.6 feet tall. You know, you have to apply some logic in that type of thing. But that's whole nother, that's a whole nother thing about learning surveying and that.
Yeah.
My big bugaboo is erasures. We will make mistakes when we record numbers. It's inevitable. And the idea, when we do make a mistake, we own up to it. We don't try to disguise that we made a mistake by scribbling things out or writing over something over and over again until it becomes heavier and obvious. You strike it out with a single number and you write the correct number above it or below it. We purposely lay out our field book pages so that there's a lot of room on them. They're not crowded. So that way, if we do make a mistake, we can write it above or below. There's room to do it without making the notes too cluttered. Surveyors' field notes in pencil are generally admissible as evidence in court, but if it's shown that there's an alteration that data, it can affect the credibility of the entire field book. And somebody asked me in Nevada, find a case law to cite for this. I did dig around a little bit and I found some stuff in Brown's, which I'll pull up here in just a minute. But this is one of the toughest habits for anyone to break, is erasing in the field, because you're so used to it. When you write, you flip over the pencil and you start erasing with respect to it. So I killed a couple birds with one stone when I taught, because the textbook center didn't like carrying 4H leads because nobody bought them except us. I bought a bunch of cheap 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencils, and then I bought 4H lead, and I provide the students with the binder and field book pages and the pencil for them to do their fields. So then they turn that in at the end of the lab. And then I cut the erasers off the ends of the pencils so that the erasers are not there. And you see, the first time they make a mistake, they flip that thing over and they try to erase it, and they can't because there's no eraser there. It drives that point home. So, you know, they have to use my pencil and my leads and that type of thing. But that is a really tough habit to break. And I don't care how careful you are when you erase something in a field book. Because you're doing that 4H lead on that paper, it's almost impossible to erase it and not leave any evidence of it behind. Plus, there'll be an imprint in the paper where that erasure occurred and that type of thing. If you're working with a bound book, I can almost guarantee you eraser crumbs are going to get caught in the binding and stuff. So you want to not erase in there. You'll make mistakes, but there are ways to deal with it. Here's what I pulled up from Evidence and Procedures for Boundary Location, 7th edition. Field notes kept in loose leaf books or field books that contain erasures are considered as suspect by the courts and present problems because of the ease with which pages may be substituted or data may be altered. Okay. And then going back to say, well, what about digital data collection? With universal acceptance of data collectors for with the universal acceptance of data collectors for field work, hardbound field books are being regulated to archives, in that much of the data is now stored electronically. For forensic surveys, it is suggested that field information still be maintained in bound field books, for the legality of the electronic field books has yet to be tested in a court of law. Once the legality of electronic data storage has been tested legally, then a positive statement can be made. So basically, you're still stronger with a written document in a court than you are with a digital record of files. Plus, it's easier to explain. If you look at a set of field notes, you can pretty much see what it says. You ever dump a data file out of a data collector and try to figure out what all those numbers are? It shows everything to like 16 decimal places. And you know you didn't measure things to 16 decimal places, but all these huge numbers, and you try to explain that to someone, it's not as easy to visualize what that represents like a written record, like a field book does. We're very visual people in that respect. There are correct ways. If you do screw up a whole page, you avoid the entire page, and then you recompile it and identify as recompiled from page whatever, and reuse the information that is reusable, otherwise fill it in with other additional measurements, and then make the connections back and forth. So it's understood this is a recompilation. You didn't just tear out these pages, throw them away, and start all over again. Sign and date each page on completion. That verifies data completeness and data validity. Boom, boom. And digital data collection and field notes. It's my contention that field notes are great for augmenting digital data. Again, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying that we should get rid of digital data collection entirely and all that types. I think it's wonderful. I think it adds a great amount of flexibility in data collection capabilities. But I also think that field notes can be used to help augment that information, particularly if you're going to be giving it to someone else to try to figure out what's going on. So typically, what I had the students do is to record in their notes the same stuff that they're inputting into the data collector to ensure that they're putting it up on the right point and they're orienting correctly. Because you probably run into situations where you've set up on a point, backset up point, collected literally hundreds and hundreds of points. And when you pop them into the software to plot them, everything looks great, except it's all on the wrong side of the road. Because you're either set up on the wrong point or you're oriented on the wrong point or whatever, and things just kind of got rotated. So basically what I have them do is document on paper what they set up digitally as far as orientation and that type of thing. The other thing that happens is you input an incorrect feature code. And sometimes you'll catch that right away and you can edit it while you're out in the fly when you're working with digital data, or sometimes you just reshoot it and you wind up with another data point, or sometimes you forget about it entirely. Or an instrument setup is disturbed, or you've got, like I said, the wrong control points. One of the things I found out that's really handy for students to do, and is a good thing even for seasoned people doing it out with a total station collecting topographic data, is once you orient yourself with respect to your backside point, you're set up on your occupied point, you orient to your backside point, immediately swing over the area where you're going to be doing your data collection and pick a distant point and just record to that point what the angle is, the horizontal angle to it. Just record it and write it down. Then every 10, 20 points, just zip into that and pick up on it again and just double check it to make sure that you're still reading that same angle. Inevitably, what happens, particularly when somebody's new to working with a piece of equipment, a wrong button gets pushed or a wrong slow motion gets locked or unlocked or whatever, and you wind up shifting the horizontal circle a little bit. Well, if you don't notice that, if you collect a couple hundred points and your data looks good and then suddenly starts to go weird and that type of thing, you got to try to figure out where that happened, or you might not be able to. But if you check in there periodically, and then you check into it once, we're shifted by a degree here. So you know where it happened between the last time you checked and this time that you checked. So if you record that information, you know exactly where it occurred and how to systematically deal with compensating that error later on. So just a simple field check like that and recording that information. You're not actually taking a reading, you know, taking a shot on something. You're just verifying something when you're measuring out in the field. The other thing is, depending on how you collect data, if you collect data by feature or if you collect data by area, what I find with the students was it was handy for them to go down one edge of the feature line, come back up the other side of the feature line. So they might start with 0.1001 here for the sidewalk, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way this way, and flip to the other side, and start reading that way. So they would record in their field notes 1001 to 1010 south edge of sidewalk, 1020, 1030 north edge of sidewalk, just again to reinforce the data they're collecting out in the field. Any other comments? Code, incorrect code should have been whatever, so that could be edited later on. run into situations where you don't have a code, or the code that you have isn't sufficiently accurate enough, particularly if you're collecting attributes at the same time. And again, a sketch to show what's being collected out in the field. So basically all this is the only information that I would collect for a topographic survey using a digital data collector. And the amount of data that's on this side here is going to be a function of what happened out into the field. If I don't have a particular type of tree identifier, I've got a code for a digital, I've got a digital code for a deciduous tree, but I don't have a walnut in there or a size for it. I could record that kind of attribute information on here if I'm not collecting attribute information. And again, any of the setup and orientation information, so I can be sure that when I put that data into software, it's coming in the way it's supposed to be coming in. So it's using it as an augmentation. The other thing is not just for collecting data. We call them field notes because it's for collecting information out in the field. But we can also be using it for stakeout information. We do, again, a lot of this stuff with digital data collection. But traditionally, if we're doing curves, like say a horizontal curve, vertical curve stakeout, you generate the information inside and then you create a set of stakeout notes. And then from that, you then send it out to the field and they do the curve stakeout. And I always had my students compute the curve tables upside down. And they'd always say, oh, why do we do them upside down? Well, traditionally, that's the way you would do a curve table, because the curve table then corresponds to a visual representation of the thing as you lay it out in the field. The BC is the point that you're standing at, and as you're looking down the curve, you're looking at the points further and further away, and that's what the curve table represents. So again, there's that connection, the visual connection between the numbers and the field operation. There are other things that you don't pre-compute, but you have to actually compute out in the field. If you've ever done any sanitary sewer stakeout or any pipeline stakeout and that type of thing, we've got new cuts and fills, cut sheets and that type of thing. You can pre-compute a lot of the information for the finished, but you don't know what actually goes on the cuts, on the stakes for cuts or fills, until you're actually out in the field and making measurements out to determine what the actual ground elevations are. So some of it's pre-computed, other of it's recorded out in the field. And then you fill it out and it all makes sense. Non-measurement data. The last couple of years I've been doing some of the senior design class at civil engineering program here. All the seniors are required to go through a senior design project where they get a project, they work with a client, and they design something for that client. And then design varies all sorts of different things, from roads to hangars, buildings, shelters, different structures and all that. But almost all of them use some sort of spatial data. And if they're not going to collect the data, because it's a large area, what we use is LiDAR. And Wisconsin is one of the states that's got full LiDAR coverage throughout the entire state. All the counties have been flown, and we're constantly updating that stuff. So the students have access to high density, high quality LiDAR information that they can use for their projects. Well, part of what we do is kind of an extension of what they learn in the surveying classes. We don't just grab the LiDAR data and run with it. We try to find out something about the quality of the LiDAR data. And normally when the LiDAR data is flown, after it's already been collected, then a lot of field verification surveys take place. And you'll see reports for the different counties where they've done the field verification surveys under the different types of conditions in that. This is an example of a relatively recent field verification survey that was done by a firm that went out there and for Grant County identified a couple of different sites around Grant County, Wisconsin for different types of ground cover and GPSed those locations and compared them against the LiDAR stuff. So what they have on here is field notes indicating what they did on the field. And that's part of their report that they submitted for the verification information for the quality of that LiDAR information. So that when they come in there and they say the 95% confidence interval, the vertical elevations is plus or minus 0.5 feet, I've got the support information I can go to and see where they did that, how they did it, who did it, what kind of equipment they were using. All that stuff is there, not just in the metadata saying that it's that good. I can go all the way back to the report, all the way back to the original field notes that they had for the actual field verification. So that's still stuff that's being done. If you've ever done any surveying and stuff, and you collect a bunch of information, you're doing analysis of why you're accepting some evidence versus other evidence. You want to document that information. We just started in Wisconsin using survey reports. Those weren't required for surveys that we've done here. They've been used in a lot of other jurisdictions out there. But I think it's a wonderful tool because it allows us to document something that's very difficult to document just on a map. You've got a written report that goes with it. Well, you can document a lot of this stuff out in the field directly when you're out there indicating what you collected out in the field, what you found out in the field, and record that information on there. How many of you did the homework assignment where I had the little guy that tootled out there and you found the jack handle and all that kind of stuff? That's some pretty valuable information. And the guy that provided it's giving you a lot of potentially useful information. But you want to document it somehow. And one way to document it is to have them sign a statement out in the field and use that as a written document then. Because in court, if you just relay, this is what the guy told you, it's hearsay evidence. You heard it and you responded to, and you're repeating it. And in the repetition of that information, there could be some alteration of that information. I mean, you might not remember it exactly the way the guy told it to you, but if you have him sign a document, he's attesting to the accuracy of the information that's recorded there. Great place to do that's in the field book. Okay, okay, so in closing, real quick and dirty here. Okay, prevalent, data collection and staking technology is digital. I still think there's a role for field notes to help augment some of that stuff. And from a learning perspective, it's still a good way to get into understanding why we do things the way we do them in surveying. The whole idea is that we're trying to minimize errors. And that's why we use the procedures that we use. That's why we apply the corrections that we do, is to minimize those errors. So the notes, when we document that stuff, record not just the measurements, but the conditions, the equipment, and the personnel that were used to make those measurements. So field notes are also highly adaptable to different situations. You really can't come up with a situation that you can't use a field note for. Hell, in a pinch, if you sit down for a coffee break and the table wobbles, you can rip a page out and use it to shimmy up the leg on the table so it doesn't shake on you and that type of thing. There's no end of uses for field notes now. It's compatible with any hardware, software, and instrument platform. You don't have to worry about compatibility issues. And like I say, it's good augmentation, explanation information for people that either don't have access to the digital files themselves, the original digital files themselves, or need to understand what was actually done out in the field beyond what's in the digital files. And as kind of in closing, this is a survey that was done in Wisconsin back in the 1830s. Part of what the surveyors were supposed to do, remember, it was survey before sale. And part of what the surveyors were supposed to do is take an inventory of what was on the land. So when people bought the land, they knew what they were buying. It was the appropriateness of it. And there wasn't a whole hell of a lot of political correctness back then, as attested to by this. The swamps are numerous, but not very murky. The soil might possibly support a Dutchman, but an Irishman would starve on it. Okay. So take that as you will, but you learn a lot of the character for some of these guys reading some of their notes and some of the hardships that they ran into. You can really feel it just reading their notes because they documented this stuff. They took the time to write that stuff down. So anyway. Are there any questions, comments, observations? I don't have the comments window open, so I don't know if there's any comments.
No. Yeah, nope, we're good. George got his hand up, though. He's ready.
Okay, George, go for it.
So Jerry, from my point of view, for me at my age, writing stuff down in a field book is a very, very good idea, because just the fact that I'm writing something down is going to reinforce that in my memory, and it's going to help just that much more. Not that I'm going to remember every project that I've ever worked on because I wrote something down, but it helps.
Now that's a real good point, because anytime you're actively doing something like that, it's reinforcing the memory in your brain, as opposed to just punching something on a computer or a calculator, that type of thing. If you actually have to write something down, like I say, you may not remember that exact particular operation or measurement, but you do remember it, and you develop that habit of making sure that you're doing things the same way. You got to develop those good habits, and you just keep reinforcing those good habits as you're going through it.
Yep. Good points. A couple of other ones on here. I saved, put in the Dropbox. Jerry's files will be in the Dropbox for week 109. There was in March of 21 on the Geoholics podcast, week number 72, there was field notes fundamentals, kind of roundtable conversation. I turned that into an article that's actually on the Mentoring Mondays website as well. And then of course, Jerry's stuff. Jerry's got all of his on his website as well. I think, don't you even have a kind of a section on field notes on your website too, Jerry?
Yeah. It's pretty much the same kind of stuff like this.
Yeah, same type of thing
for the classes.
Yeah. And then we talked about it a little bit even on with Gary Kent on the surveyor's report. If you're not taking notes, but you do have those problem child boundaries, we were talking about just reiterating, like adding that information to the model space of a CAD drawing, right? And so maybe you're not putting things in a field book, which you should be, but at least if you're writing things down or typing them in, some of the issues you had while you're working on that project, at least typing them in model space of the CAD drawing so that it's there and can jog your memory as well. But so
you can also scan an XREF them in for
there you go.
Also,
if you did the field notes, that's perfect.
Yeah, that's one of the things that when you start working with CAD files and project files and stuff, it starts to balloon in no time flat.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems I have with, like having a digital data file and then having any recording files that you may be recording and any photo files and all that. Pretty soon it starts to really, kind of blow out of proportion. And that's one of the nice things about a field book. If you're used to a field book, you're used to data organization.
Right.
And I think people that come from that mindset have a better job or do a better job of maintaining that kind of organization with the digital files than somebody that just jumps in and does it with digital files. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at student projects and they say map 1, map 2, map 3,
right.
40 different versions of the same stinking map, and they can't tell you what each one is because they just keep making a new one. So
yeah.
Soapbox.
No, you're good. Does anybody want to chime in? Want to add some additional comments or anything to Jerry's presentation? It's we thought when we first jumped on here, we actually got to like 26 or 28 on here at one point, but we laughed that when Jerry and I first started that it was just going to be a bunch of the old time surveyors that still want to do field notes, but we got a mixture of everybody on here. We did good. Just need somebody to chime in. Nobody.
If anybody does have any questions or any comments, I've got my contact information and my email and my website if you need some additional information there. And I haven't posted the assignment answer key yet because I don't know how many people are going to be doing it. So until somebody asks me for it,
there you go.
Post one.
Somebody's going to ask for it this week. Somebody will watch it.
Yeah.
And they'll request it. Should have it up probably by tomorrow. So we should be good. Anything else? Anybody else? It's always quiet. A couple of these topics are kind of quiet.
Yeah, I did really good or I did really bad. It's just like it's when they're that quiet. It's
That's right. Yeah. You get a thumbs up from George, and he's watched it twice. So
never gets old, huh, George?
that's right.
So one question, where's the website I can find Jerry information again?
Yeah, I threw it up in the chat, but it's just his name and last name.com. So jerrymahun.com. I'll throw it. Yeah, I can copy it one more time. I'll copy it and throw it in there.
Yeah,
you go to that chat box.
And then just under the home button, just click on that, and it opens up a drop-down menu for some different parts of my website there.
All right, thank you, Jerry. So I'm in Florida, so
cool, awesome. We had from Africa on last week. That was awesome. So, all right, everybody. Well, as always, Jerry, I appreciate your time. And
Jerry, can you hear me?
Oh, there you go, John.
Yeah. Hey, so yeah.
Who am I talking to? I see the top of a cap.
John Wise.
Yeah, John Wise. Hey, I'll try and pick it up a little bit.
Okay, there we go. Okay.
I surveyed for a government agency for 32 years, and when we do traverses, we would try and get 3 solid bearing objects to each traverse point, and take a compass bearing to those traverse points. And then we would write that down in the field book and then mention what the traverse point was, go through the traverse, then run our closure, run our closing angle and everything. And that would all be written down in the book. Okay. And therefore, if someone else picked the job up, sometimes it would be 3 years down the road, they would pick it up. They could go out there and find out exactly what I did, what I used, so on and so forth. Then after that, we would run differential levels over the points to verify the elevations, so on and so forth. And it would all be in the book. And we would use a 6-ring binder, and we would number it. We didn't number it like you did, like page 6. It was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 going through there. And like you say, erasing is a bad habit. But if somebody picked that book up, and I've seen this happen more than once, have a book get dropped and spring open because they were so full, because the job had just been going on for so long. And be able to go back and retrace that and pick that up. And, field notes are inevitable. And I, being the party chief, when we would go out and tie a corner, even if it's just a property corner, I would make mention of something that was close by. Hey, there's a 6x6 wooden fence post 2 feet northwest of this corner, with such and such cap stamped, whatever. So, but yeah, I'm a big advocate of field notes, and I agree with you on the 4-H lead. I have seen guys try and do field notes with HB, and it looks like an axe murderer filled them out. So
exactly. They just smear everywhere. Yep.
Oh yeah. So, hey, great presentation, good information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jerry, I got to know what you do all your graphics in, because you do such a good job on those graphics. And then the other one is you got to remove the eraser off of this picture.
I got to remove the eraser off. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's because I didn't cut it off of that one. That's for the seasoned surveyor. He's not supposed to erase.
There you go.
I once had a student from Africa. I've had a lot of students from Africa use my website because they can't afford textbooks down there, so they use my website. But he was an instructor down there, and he asked me how I did the graphics and stuff, and I told him, geez, you opened up a can of worms right now, because I use all sorts of different things to come up with this stuff. So I just put together, I sent you a little video that I put together for him that showed him what I did.
Yeah, that's cool.
It's just absolutely, there's no rhyme, or it's just kind of something I developed over the years.
That's cool. Yeah, no, it's amazing graphics. I love when you put them all together. So Cool. All right. Anybody else want to chime in?
Hey, Trent.
Hey.
This is here. Sorry, chimed in a little bit late,
Oh,
but
you're good.
yeah, we've kind of been combining field notes with photos. With the technology now, if you've got a tablet, you can take a photo and then you can go to the edit with a pencil and literally write your notes right on top of the photo. That's been a huge tool for us. I mean, it's a lot of these jobs we're only using a tablet per the, so it works out, and we're kind of form it into your workflow, and it's pretty handy at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what George was saying before. There's that act of writing, actually writing something that reinforces what you're doing, as opposed to texting or that kind of crap, or that you're actually writing something down. And in this case, it's in a digital form, but it's not like a digital data collector at that point. We're just punching a code or that type of thing. You're actively involved in that reinforcement type of thing. So I think that's a great way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Will, go ahead, Will.
Oh yeah, no, I was just saying it. Traditionally we would always take photos and we would write the photo number in the field book. We'd write the direction that the photo was taken and then a little description of what it was. But you would turn in these files and we would take the time to itemize all this stuff, and then you'd still get the call. Well, what's going on here? And you're like, well, did you look at the pictures? I looked at the picture, but I didn't, did you look at the notes? Oh, I didn't get the notes. And so it's always, when they have the picture right there and it says, you have a little arrow drawn and then a little description on what the issue is, maybe a station to identify where you're at on the map. But it's, another way that, technology is kind of helping out a little bit.
Yeah, but it's you always want to be the ones in charge, as opposed to having the software be the one that's in charge, because that then it makes more sense. I
was gonna say, if you ever see Will, he's got that tablet in his hand no matter where he's at. he's loaded up. That's his Bible.
Well, it's a data collector now too. Some of the receivers that we're running, and we're running these apps, and
right.
Literally that's your data collector. It's your email. You're flying a drone with it. I mean, then someone calls you. It's.
I was gonna say, it's your scanner. You're scanning manholes.
Yep. That's what I take pictures of my notes and I say, this is my scanner, exactly.
I love it. Good stuff. Thanks, Will. Anything else? Anybody else want to chime in? Well, as always, Jerry, I love it. Thank you. Have a good week, everybody. Last Wisdom Wednesdays is this Wednesday, at least until the fall. We're finishing up the last book that the evidence and procedures that Jerry just mentioned in his field notes. Evidence Procedures, 7th edition. So that's the last one, and then we'll come back in the fall with another book. So hope to see everybody then. But
all right,
have a good week, everybody. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Good night.